one I did a long time ago. This is encaustic, and it's an extreme example of accretion, which is a term not unique to encaustics, but it is a building up. And you start with simply brush strokes, going back and forth and back and forth, and building on the ridges of the brush strokes. And this just happens to be what grew out of it. It actually had a missing piece area, I should say. And I thought, oh, it's kind of looking like it's moving to a heart shape. Well, so that's what it is. It wasn't any grand plan. There's easily 5 pounds of wax on that, easily, at least. So that's just an interesting thing. People are always very drawn to that when they come in the room for obvious reasons, or into the studio. So that's an extreme example of accretion with encaustics. Lines, and certainly some oil pastels in here. This is an example of what I was just trying to show with drilling down and what happens when the paint kind of comes on itself, up on itself. This is a small example. It's not crazy about the painting, but it happens to have India ink on it. And it's, again, an example. There's more accretion, a buildup, but the sheen that India ink can have with encaustic and how it can be used. It's a little duller here because I went over it with some medium, but it can be very useful if you carefully, because this starts to separate like it did down here with the heat gun or the torch. It's very interesting to watch it move around. These are small examples of using a stencil and more medium. This is just a stencil that has squares in it, and using, again, a small panel, small piece of wood, and going over it with a few colors, but using medium on the stencil, and then using some of the oil pastels on it to sort of brighten it up. And this is a very, very simple painting. It just shows how much I like white more than anything else. Could be some of our waves coming in on cooking, whatever, but I like it. This also shows using a stencil and doing what lines a stencil can do. There's some compositions that I repeat, and this has to do with space division, lines, and again using a stencil for repeat patterns, which is a good way to use it. You don't have to draw it all yourself, but you can use it as a basis for drawing. And this has oil pastels on it. You can see the sheen of that bronze up there again, and it has the crayons emphasizing the circles. This I did a long time ago. It has a lot of string in it, a lot of stuff, just a lot of buildup. And but it's just an example of what can happen. Again, there's accretion involved. This is a result of accretion. These are little dots, just the buildup and what happens as time goes on. You can scrape some of that off, keep it, whatever you want, of course, actually. This took an enormous amount of time, and I picked away at the edges of that pattern with this tool and this end of it, just cleaning up the edges. That alone took a lot of time, but sometimes you have patience for things, sometimes you don't. And then going around that with an oil stick, a black oil stick, which is pigment and oil, and wiping that off, again being very meticulous about the cleanup job on that. And interestingly enough, the white encaustic paint, when you go over it initially with a heat gun, which is what I did here, it's concave. Going over it again, carefully, slowly, very slowly, with a pattern that's as complex as that, it gets flat, letting that set up a little bit, going over it again with a heat gun several times, very, very carefully, because you're going to have to clean up the edges if you've got stuff spilling over, and it starts to puff. I don't know anybody else who deals with encaustic that does that, and I just happened on it. I'm sure somebody must know that trick, if you will. But that's what makes this a little bit different, and yet an example of a fairly complicated pattern and how you have to be extremely patient in putting it, finishing it slowly, slowly, slowly. This is a fairly recent painting that is incorporates all kinds of things. Using pink on here, it's almost like using white, but it's just more of a subtle difference to the white, and using the crayon, using these perforated strips that I was just showing a little bit ago, and a lot of texture, a lot of cutting in, a lot of scraping, the crayons, everything, kind of everything. The stencil is a basis for these shapes, and the stencil gets scraped too. It's not the whole pattern that ever gets used. I'm always scraping into it, defining it, undefining it. It's a process of give and take, back and forth, trying to balance the whole thing out in the end. Here's another one that has India ink on it. You can see the sheen of it. It was just an example piece I used, panel I was using in a workshop, and it happened to work out pretty well. A little crayon at the end, and there you are. This is about the same composition as the one at the top over there, if you can shoot that enough or not. And I'll probably do this again just to see how it comes out the next time. It has to do with space divisions, always, it's the problem to deal with. 2/3 versus, or almost 3/4 versus 1/4, maybe even more and less. But going through it with a line, having some vertical lines to it, having significant patterns going across, and of course different colors than when I did it several years ago. This is a small painting that I just love. It's one of those that sort of painted itself, and don't ask me how that happens, but it does. Just started putting these white blobs down sort of, and adding a little bit of turquoisey kind of color there, and sometimes you have to know when to stop, and that's an example of when to stop. It just worked out. I wish it were bigger, but it isn't. It could be disciples, it could be a hockey team, could be sardines. I've had all those things offered as descriptions of what they must be. Here's an example of white on white. I wish it weren't on these boards, but it is. And it's one of those things that's certainly not for everybody, but it's an example of using white on white that I particularly like. The workshop I was in, we had our assortment of paints, and that was what was initially on here, and I didn't like what was in the middle, and I don't remember what it was all to begin with, but anyway, just scraped the middle out and took some of the scrap wax that was below the top counter where I was working, and put it on here in these blobs, and then divided those blobs out with this and developed kind of heads for those figures, if you can call them that. And to me, this has always been Aztec warriors.